This is our second lecture on chapters 18 and 19. This is dealing again with Cold War America and everything in yellow. If you see, you're going to see a new policy that the United States begins to follow called brinkmanship. And before we can dive in deeper into that, we have to understand that this policy is going to have its formation in, like we've seen a lot of in this chapter, the end of World War II. The end of World War II sees the United States launching Operation Paperclip. And what we see is that towards the end of World War II, German scientists have begun to roll out frightening new kinds of aerial weapons that begin to kind of frighten of with better production capabilities and better logistical things, but really have had an effect in the war, but they're not going to do that. So we see the first development and the use of jet engine powered airplanes by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, towards the end of the World War II. By the end of World War II, most of the major combatants have uh, prototypes of different jet engines in various stages of production and kind of workability. But it's the Germans who are the first to get into battle a jet powered fighter plane, which by all accounts from Allied servicemen who went up against it, it was a very frightening and a very effective airplane that kind of took the skies, but not in the numbers that was needed to be what Hitler wanted to turn the war. The other major weapon that they displayed was the V-1 and later into the V-2 ballistic missiles. The V-2 traveled at nearly 4 times the speed of sound and was a precursor to the modern moon rockets, so you can see why they would be highly valued by the Allies and the Soviet Union. And so, as the war begins to wind down, and as both the Americans from the West and the Soviets from the East begin to conquer giant chunks of Germany, there's a race between both nations in order to be able to search out German scientists and, more importantly, their research. On the American side, this was called Operation Paperclip. And the Americans are going one around Germany and France and other places in order to be able to find uh, German scientists in their research. The big catch for the Americans was the head of the V-2 ballistic missile program for Nazi Germany, Werner von Braun. And he was then brought back to the United States and was allowed to stay there and work there on the condition that he work with the United States rocketry program. In in return, the United States would overlook his uh, um, record as a kind of a war criminal and a big giant jerk while he was developing those missiles in Germany. So that's the Me 262, the jet powered fighter plane that the Nazis rolled out towards the end of the war. And more importantly, more scary for the people of Western Europe who were subjected to these rocket attacks was the V 2 rocket. Again, able to soar up to the upper edges of the atmosphere and again, as you can see, it looks very similar to what eventually the Americans will be strapping human beings to in the formation of their rocket and space programs later on. Werner von Braun, when he's brought to the United States, is asked where does he want to set up his rocketry program with other American scientists and other Nazi German defectors, and he chooses, of all places, northern Alabama. And when asked why, he says it reminds him most of his native Germany. So a lot of the German stuff still comes out from there. The other major policy that begins to kind of come out of this technological race is a nuclear arms race between the Americans and the Soviet Union. The United States is the first country to be able to put a nuclear bomb through trials, detonating the first nuclear weapon in July of 1945 before successfully doing it again in August over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they have a monopoly of the atomic bomb, sharing it only with a few allies until the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic bomb in 1949. Now, they were able to do this by stealing information from the Allies. And so their atomic bomb program was based a lot upon information from Soviet spies within the Manhattan Project. And then that's why it took them a little bit longer to develop their bomb because they had to piece together from the information gleaned from their spies in order to do so. So the United States was not happy about that, but more importantly, they were hoping to be able to build bigger and better weapons. It, American scientists realized as early as 1942 that a possibility existed for an even larger nuclear bomb, and this program was then spun off the Manhattan Project and led by the physicist Edward Teller. And what he developed and later was kicked off the program developing for was called the H bomb or hydrogen bomb. This would be a hydrogen fueled thermonuclear bomb. Instead of a fission reaction in the early atomic bombs, this would be fusing hydrogen atoms together, just like what's done in the center of stars. The hydrogen bomb marked a kind of a race to be able to develop it first, to have the bigger and best bomb in the world. And in order to be able to help out with the calculations, new supercomputers were needed in order to be able to do the complex mathematical computations and running the formulas and the results in order to be able to handle a bomb of this size. So this was also a boon for the supercomputing industry in the United States as well. The H bomb was finally detonated successfully for the first time by the Americans on November 1st, 1952. They did this at the Enotok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, and this is deep in the Pacific Ocean. Not deep wise, but like in the Pacific itself. H bomb, when it was set off, carved a hole 1 mile long and over 175 feet deep. It unleashed 10.9 megatons of explosive power. The Japanese atomic bombs dropped on them were measured in kilotons. So this is a magnitude of 100 more. So we're talking about a major giant explosion that we'll see some footage of in this clip.
4, 3, 2, 1, T0.
So this is a picture of the first Soviet atomic bomb and its developments like this that led to the United States to push Edward Teller and his group to develop again the IV Mike explosion that we just saw a video of. And so was detonated on November 1st, in the 1950s. Um, when the bomb went off, it within nanoseconds of the fusion reaction, every single element in the universe was created inside of the explosion, including several artificial ones from how dense it was, which was denser in some parts with its neutrons than stars itself. The Within seconds, a blinding white fireball was seen more than 3 miles across. The Hiroshima fireball was only 1/10 of a mile. And the crews of the Estes force, along with other Navy and Army and Air Force observers in there, could feel heat flash upon their faces, even though they were 30 miles away. Sailors said it was almost like you could feel the oven door on your face, like the heat of the opening of the oven door on your face again, and they were 30 miles away within seconds. Um, the wings of a B-36 orbiting 15 miles from ground zero at 40,000 feet had its wingtips heated to 93 degrees almost instantaneously from there. In a minute and a half, the fireball reached 57,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. The cloud passed over 100,000 feet um, in height, and that's the 2.5 minutes was how long it took for the shock wave, with first a sharp shock like a thunderbolt, and then a low rumble reached the Estes, the ship that gave the final blow. After 5 minutes, the cloud splashed against the stratosphere and began to spread out, its top cresting at 27 miles. So this is 27 miles across and nearly 8 miles high. By the time it was done spreading out, the canopy reached over 100 miles in length, and it formed and it caused heavy radioactive mud and rain to fall out of the sky from there. Um, It vaporized and lifted into the air 80 million tons of solid material that would fall all around the world. And Scientists who went back in along with the Navy a couple days later found fish who were swimming in the atoll who looked on one side, the side facing the explosion, like they had been dropped into a hot pan and were seared from there. The megatons was 10.4 megatons, the first megaton yield thermonuclear explosion on Earth. The fireball alone would have engulfed Manhattan, which was you can kind of see from this picture, and would have obliterated all of New York City's five boroughs. The Edward Teller, who again was kicked off the research team for stuff we don't have time really to get into, knew when the detonation was supposed to occur. So him and a couple of his fellow scientists went into the basement of the lab at Cal Berkeley, and 20 minutes from when the explosion went off, they could see seismographs in the bottom of California begin to move, and so they could feel this across the Pacific Ocean from there. And so that's how the world entered the thermonuclear stage of these atomic programs. So the Soviet Union, again with its spies and with its development, was hot on the heels of the United States, and it exploded its first hydrogen bomb nearly 8 months later. It's at this point that the United States realizes that they need to stand up to the Soviet Union, and that they're going to require a vast buildup of their armed forces in order to be able to deliver these nuclear weapons in the case of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So that led to the development of what's called National Security Council Document 68, or NSC 68, which was made in 1950. What this important document for the 20th century called for was capital letters, vast increases in U.S. defense spending, particularly compared to previous periods of peacetime in the United States defense building. The NSC 68 also called for the United States to build up its nuclear and conventional forces and to be able to use the new weapons on the battlefield from there. NSC 68 also called for the United States of having a policy for flexible response, where the United States was going to commit itself to putting out all these fires all over the world and trying to mitigate small problems before they bubbled oil over into large problems on a worldwide scale. What this leads to is what many will come to refer to, particularly in future President Dwight D. Eisenhower, what's called the military industrial complex. The idea that what's good for the United States is development in its military. The military will then bleed over into private sector development, and from there, and if you take away spending from research and development and building up the military, you're going to hurt the economy of the United States. And so people are going to rally against this once they start to realize the vast amounts of billions of dollars being spent on the United States. What this delivers on the world stage is the Americans are going to go to a policy of brinksmanship. The United States is willing to go to the edge of an all out war by trimming its army and navy and building up its air force. The United States had B 29 bombers at the height of the Cold War circling the airspace of the Soviet Union with the with thermonuclear payloads ready to go 24 hours a day for years on end, waiting for the United States military to give them to go to fly and drop their payloads into the heart of the Soviet Union. So the United States is showing what we saw Winston Churchill bring up in our last lecture, the idea that, again, if the Soviet Union only respects a tough military response, even in peacetime, well, that's what the United States is doing that. So this is the document. Again, it's the 68th National Security Council document. That's why it's NSC 68, even though it's being delivered in 1950. And what it does is it really kind of sets the American armed forces compared to everybody else in the world. This is an older graph, but here in 2020, the United States is spending just under $700 billion, which is the same as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 other countries, including Russia and China in 2012, combined. And that's what's kind of getting into. And so in future presidents will kind of rally against this and come to their head, particularly Dwight D. Eisenhower, who gives a famous speech that says, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwanted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military industrial complex. Potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes." So this is what the reaction to NSC 68 will come out later, but this is the but the document itself is trying to again come up with this idea led by people in the government, particularly Alan Dulles, saying that the United States can go all the way up to the brink of war, stand tiptoe with the Russians, and see who's going to blink first because, based on who's got the bigger and better weapons. So we see this arms race develop from there. In 1945, this is the bomb drop on Nagasaki, which is the best atomic bomb in the world. And you can see the size difference between what we have in 2018. This is the largest nuclear bomb, the thermonuclear bomb the Soviet Union had at its arsenal, and this is the smallest one that could fit an artillery shell. And in some of these intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are available by the 1980s and 1990s, you can see all of the different, the numerous nuclear warheads that are capable of being delivered in there from this stuff. And this delivers throughout the 1950s and 1960s by both the Americans and the Soviet Union, along with other nations like France and Great Britain, detonating and testing these atomic weapons, not only to show their strength, but also to be able to work out all these different stuff there. And I'm going to show you two different clips here of nuclear bomb testings by the United States.
From the officer in charge just before H hour, the men disappear into their foxholes. Every precaution has been taken for their safety. They're told to crouch low, shield their eyes, and remain down until the signal to rise is given. Now the moment of greatest anxiety, waiting those last few seconds. Seconds later, the blast wave reaches the trenches. As the tower of smoke and flame looms overhead, one thought is uppermost in all minds. Now it's over. The fury of it had stunned some, but not one was injured. High above, the smoke ring puffed by atomic breath rises skyward, watched by the men who had faced it.
So that was just one of several different tests. Again, you can see all the different soldiers that are being exposed to all this radiation, which you can probably imagine is not going to end up great for them. Is not a healthy thing to do. And again, the United States had developed, their own artillery shells that could fire nuclear warheads at the end of it, and they even shrunk a nuclear warhead down to the size of the smallest weapon called the Davy Crockett, which was basically a bazooka fired nuclear weapon that the guy firing it wouldn't end well for him. But that's how small they would get it. Actually, one more nuclear test uh, before we move on. So this one doesn't have any sound to it, so let me speak over it. But here, the atomic bomb's been dropped. The soldiers are there to watch that, and the idea is what happens on the battlefield when you drop an atomic bomb. Can the soldiers march into it? That's what it is. So there's the first shockwave. You'll see this a couple times here. What's shaking the camera is the shockwave that you'll see. So that's it is, and this is from one of the trenches. Yeah, that's all the nuclear blast into those guys' face. And then you'll see their orders are to get up and then march into the atomic fireball, just like how they would if this was the case on the battlefield. So most of the nuclear testing in the United States was done in the vast desert of Nevada, but some of this nuclear testing was done close enough to Las Vegas that that was one of the attractions of coming to Vegas during the 50s and 60s, was to be able to see the fireballs and the mushroom clouds off in the distance from the strip. I mean, I've stayed at this hotel from here, the Hotel Fremont, and so again, that's how close those nuclear bombs were to going off from there. And so this comes the atomic bomb, really the atomic age, really plays a large part in the pop culture of the 1950s. There's a Miss Atomic Bomb contest in Las Vegas that's held for a couple years. You, as a little boy, you can practice dropping your atomic bombs from your U.S. Air Force bomber. And then again, they gave out chemistry kits with actual uranium in them, so kids could go and little kids could go and practice and be like their famous scientists. This was the payload of a B-29 that the United States built up in order to be able to use in the case of a war with the Soviet Union. The stockpile for the United States is going to be over the next couple of slides here. What this is showing you is how many warheads the United States had, peaking at over 30,000 in the 60s before kind of working your way up there. And again, you can see how many hydrogen bombs were capable of being delivered before, again, smaller bombs were kind of measured from there. And again, you can see the buildup of the stockpile. And as we moved closer to more of our times, we see the reduction of these nuclear weapons, which become a major campaign for Nixon and Carter and Ford in the 1970s, and even with more recent presidents as well. The the cost tag of this is extraordinary, and you can see effects for this on Google Earth. There's famously in California the boneyard of the U.S. military, where they have all these B-29s that aren't flyable, but the B-29s that are still in service from some of these time periods. There's stories of grandfathers and fathers and sons all being a part of the same B-29 because of they've been able to keep these some of these planes going since the end of World War II. But they've been able to do that by scrapping some of the planes that they have from there. So the Cold War begins to spread around the world, not just through nuclear weapons, but through covert actions as well. In September of 1947, the United States passes what's called the National Security Act. What this does is creates new departments within the cabinet, the Department of Defense, creates a National Security Council, so that's why there's only 68 documents by the time you get to 1950, and an intelligence agency. That intelligence agency is the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and it was tasked to use spies and other information gathering techniques to gather information abroad and to conduct secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments unfriendly to the United States. The NSC 68 document in 1950 gave the CIA a much wider role, including espionage, psychological warfare, uh, uh, beefing up its covert operations and paramilitary activity. This document gave a 6 times increase in its budget than it had when it was first created in 1947, which was kind of a precursor of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, that was conducting similar types of operations during World War II. The CIA has some very early successes. We'll talk about two in particular. One success it had in the end of the 1940s was in Italy. Italy, as we saw in our last chapter, was being kind of inundated with communist literature and propaganda, and kind of people running for things there. And the CIA was sent in, and one of the first thing it does was start to rig elections so that the non-communist candidates would win, and also flooding Italy with pro-United States and pro-democracy propaganda in order to be able to be successful there. This is contrasted with failures that it has in Europe, in Eastern Europe. For a long time, the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s was trying to parachute agents behind the Iron Curtain, particularly into Poland, are another thing. And those agents were routinely caught and murdered, along with trying to help out government operations in there. Supposedly, and again, this is where you kind of get into some conspiracy theories, is that the United States would go and try to help out people fighting against the communists in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, by dropping like kind of pallets full of gold into lakes. But the Soviets knew about this going on, so they would kill all the agents and let the gold just kind of sink there or collect the gold there. So again, if you want to go make some money, you can go hunt down supposedly lakes full of gold, American gold from the World War II. But again, it gets into some conspiracy theory stuff. So that's Truman signing the National Security Act that went and created the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency, which has gotten a bad rap and for a lot of the bad things it's done, and also has done some other things that have been helped benefit the United States as well. As it kind of goes from there, and then Eisenhower, again, doodling as he's listening to the CIA report on Guatemala here from there. So we talked about successes of the CIA in Italy. Its other success that it has in its early years is in Iran. So the two successes that we should know for the CIA are in Italy and Iran. Easy to remember, two I countries. In 1951, the prime minister for Iran nationalized the oil fields. What this meant is that any other countries who had companies go into Iran, say like the British Petroleum Company or the Shell Company, who would then put their own oil fields in and then pump out, and all the profits from that oil extraction would go back to Britain or go back to the United States. Instead, all that was seized by Iran, and those oil fields would then be run by the government for Iran so that the oil money would stay in Iran itself. As you probably can imagine, the United States and Britain is not happy about this. The British worked to boycott Iran oil and try to get all the other countries kind of in NATO and in the Western world to not buy any of Iran oil itself. The United States says, we don't really like this because it's fearful that if Iran doesn't sell its oil on the open market, it's going to go over to the Soviet Union. That flies in the face of its idea of containment, and it doesn't want Iran to go over to the Soviets in order to look for help because of the British boycott. What does the United States do? In 1953, the CIA funnels millions of dollars to back the pro American Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran is then returned to the United States returned from the United States, where he's kind of been in exile, to Iran, set up by the CIA. The Iranian government is kicked out, and he's allowed to serve there again with the financial backing of the CIA. So they're going to be able to back him, and the CIA in the United States is still going to back the Shah of Iran even through the 50s and 60s, even though he increasingly spends a lot more money on himself and looks away from the Iranian people, which is going to lead to a backlash in the 1970s. CIA is also going to be more than willing to help back dictators in the Caribbean and in Latin America if those dictators, even though they're causing brutal human rights violations in their own countries, will align themselves with U.S. interests and, more importantly, just stay away from the communists. And so as we move through the 1950s, we see several world crises develop. In 1955, we have the famous Geneva Summit in Geneva, Switzerland, where President Eisenhower puts forth an open skies proposal, the idea to try to kind of clear some of the skies to back down from the uh, kind of brinkmanship that has led up to 1955. The Soviet Union is going to reject that, and the world is going to agree from there. So this is the Shah of Iran when he's kind of formally put back there. The Shah has kind of been wined and dined by the United States for a long time. That's the Shah with his wife and other members of his government. That's Walt Disney, they're in Disneyland. That's him in a kind of a big giant meal, and that's him sitting down with the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, in the 1960s. So we kind of see the Shah and the United States are buddy buddy to be able to, again, with their policy of containment. In 1955, you have the Suez War, where the Egyptian president of Nasser tries to play the West and East against each other by kind of, well, taking over the Suez Canal and running it, whereas because of the kind of quasi colonial state Egypt's been kept in from the British. The United States is worried over increased Soviet Union presence in Egypt as Nasser tries to kind of work the Soviet Union against them. And Nasser is warned in January 1957 with the Eisenhower Doctrine. And that says the United States would defend the Middle East against any attack by any communist country. The Congress is going to approve of this in March, and that's going to have long term implications throughout the rest of the 20th century. In 1956, we see the Hungarian uprising, where Hungarians rise up and revolt for a more democratic government. And we see a brutal Soviet response to this. They invade Hungary, they kill 30,000 Hungarians, and the UN and the US does nothing in order to, again, try to mitigate a worldwide nuclear kind of major war there. What this is going to do in the United States, particularly in 1956, an election year, which is not really going great for the Republicans, and the Democrat Adlai Stevenson going for round number two is kind of gaining. But with the Hungarian uprising and it coming and going, and it's kind of the people seeing Eisenhower doing a good job of that, it's going to lead to Eisenhower's reelection. In other world news, Stalin's going to die in 1953. He's going to suffer a stroke. There's a movie that just came out recently that's a parody and a satire of this. But I mean, it's actually he suffers a stroke and dies in his room, and he might have been able to squeak out a couple more years of life if he would have gotten prompt medical um, attention. But the guards outside of Stalin's room are so afraid to ask if he's okay that they just stand there and he suffers and he dies from a stroke inside of there. And that sets the stage for the next Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, to take power in the Soviet Union after kind of some power plays behind the scenes in the Politburo there. So the Suez War deals with the President Nasser blocking the Suez Canal. The British land paratroopers on size to go and seize it. It's an important kind of development in there. In 1956, the Hungarians rise up against the communists. They try to go from there, and the Soviet Union sends in the tanks to put this down. And the Stalin dies in 53, which is again going to lead to um, free borscht from there. So you have the Americans giving away free stuff, and the Soviet Union here putting out this propaganda picture of everybody being silent and scared, and Nikita Khrushchev taking over the controls of that. The Cold War itself is going to end up taking to the skies with the space race. We'll dive deeper into this in our next chapter when we get more with the whole NASA program. But the Soviets want to show off that the rockets they hand can deliver atomic bombs. Well, you can't really show off how powerful your rockets are with an atomic bomb at the end from there. So they wanted to do this by showing how high their rockets can go up into space. October 4th of 1957, they launched Sputnik. Sputnik was the world's first artificial satellite. It reached a speed of over 18,000 miles per hour to put it into orbit around the Earth, and it made one revolution of Earth every 96 minutes. And this is going to freak the United States out. It's going to increase and really take off its own rocket program to be able to kind of catch up with this small rinky-dink little satellite, but more importantly, emitted a radio signal, so which is shown in the movie Rocket Boys, or sorry, the book Rocket Boys, the movie October Sky, where Jake Gyllenhaal, young Jake Gyllenhaal, can actually listen to Sputnik on the radio, deliver its things as it goes over the coal fields in West Virginia. The United States, kind of in response to checking on what the Soviets doing, is creating the U-2 spy plane, and this is done through what's called Operation Oxcart and takes place in Area 51 in Nevada. The culmination of Operation Oxcart is the U-2 spy plane. The United States is trying to find a way to be able to spy the Soviet Union from as high altitudes as they could. And so the plan was to create a plane, which was basically a glider, which so you should know how light those are, with a rocket pretty much attached to it, a jet engine, to be able to fly near the edge of the atmosphere in order to be able to take pictures of the Soviet Union. The cameras developed for this U-2 spy plane were so powerful that at 10 miles up, a clear picture could read a newspaper headline from somebody sitting on a park bench in the Soviet Union from there. The Soviet Union knows about these spy planes and they know about these flights over there, but they can't really do anything about it because they don't have rockets that can successfully shoot them down. And this is my foreshadowing here yet. So that's Sputnik. So there's the New York Times, again, firing the satellite into space. It's tracked at over 4 crossings there for the time this is there. It's still up there. Um, in space right now, and it's going around there. So the United States saying that they could put satellites in space to fly us. They're going to create Operation Oxcart, and you can see that if you go and do a Google Earth of Area 51, you can see they have these big, huge, giant, long runways in the middle of the Nevada desert, basically so that the planes have a long enough runway to land and take off from the speeds that they're getting up to, particularly with the later development of the SR-71 Blackbird. There's the U-2. The first ones weren't painted black on the top and blue on the bottom to hide them. They wanted to save as much weight as possible, so they're actually unpainted to get them to fly up. And again, it's a pretty simple design. It's basically a pilot, big, huge, giant wings, and a big, huge, giant jet engine to be able to get high up in the air, travel at fast speeds, and its altitude and speed is what gave it its like quote unquote stealthiness, even though the Soviet Union knew all about it. And so these are the type of pictures, not the best example, but again, what the spy plane is doing is flying over the Soviet Union and taking pictures of this particular military base and bringing that back to the United States to develop. The Operation Oxcart will later, the next development of spy planes is the SR-71 Blackbird, which is one of the great feats of like aerospace design. And again, this was also created to be able to spy on the Soviet Union from there. The one book that I have by Annie Jacobson that's on Area 51 that describes the Operation Oxcart program. There was a commander who commuted from the Area 51 to Atlanta, Georgia every day in a half hour in his SR-71 to give you an idea of just how fast they were traveling as they're traveling on the edge of space. And this is where kind of a couple things all converge together. When the SR-71's flying at, again, the edge of space, there's the edge of space. Come on, there it is, right there. From there, the pilots are landing, and there's bugs on their windshield, and they're confused. Like, hey, why are we scraping bugs off our windshield when we're traveling, like trying to nearly break out of the Earth's orbit at these speeds and stuff? And what they found out, what they discovered, is that all the atomic testing that they were doing, and these thermonuclear bombs exploding all the stuff in the air, was taking some of these unfortunate bugs and launching them into orbit around the Earth, and that just gives you an idea of just how powerful these atomic bombs are. So the U-2 spy plane is going to lead to what's called the U-2 incident in the 1960s. And this occurs on May 1st, 1960, when a Soviet pilot slash missile actually shot down a U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers. The U-2 incident gets a little murky on what exactly occurred in the seconds between when the plane was launched and then when it was up there. Um, and so basically, from what I was able to kind of coalesce, is that the uh, surface-to-air missile from the Soviet Union tracking the spy plane went up there, and this particular missile actually accidentally hit a Soviet plane, which would then caused an explosion, which then kind of broke apart the U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers, who then had his plane crash and he parachuted safely down into the Soviet Union, where he's promptly captured. He's put on a big giant show trial from the Soviet Union. He's sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, he's going to become exchanged after only a year for the American held spy, Russian spy Rudolph Abel. And the Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg movie Bridge of Spies from 2015 pretty much talks all about this entire incident from there. This causes, as you probably can imagine, increased distrust between the Soviet Union and the Americans. A summit on the arms race was to be held on May 15th of 1960, which is then promptly called off, and it basically embarrassed the United States to no end and served only to increase the tension between the two superpowers. So that's Gary Powers in in front of his U-2 spy plane. And again, just to give you a little bit of scale of the plane and what he's going and doing it. And again, he's in a G suit to be able to protect him against all the G forces from the rapid acceleration that he's from there. That's the plane being investigated as it when it crashed in there. They even brought Khrushchev to go and point out all to show himself along with the Russian people. This was all displayed so they could see that hey, and yes, the Soviet Union's not lying to you. The Americans are spying on you. And there's Gary Powers uh, being put in front of the Soviet Union as a kind of a show trial, convicted as a spy, but then exchanged in the across the famous bridge of spies in the spy exchange program. And we'll continue with what happens with all this stuff back in the United States in our next lecture.